Hi, I'm Gary Serku,
And I'm Christine Searle.
and on today's episode of CG History, we're going to be highlighting the key issues in women's struggle for equality rights in the 1920s and 30s.
World War I started in July 1914, and many Canadian men went off to fight, leaving their wives and other women at home to run the country.
There was a strong belief during this time period that women still needed to look presentable for their husbands when they returned home from work. When their husbands came home, dinner was to be ready, the house was to be clean, and the husband was to be greeted by his loving wife. Although it was more common to see women as homemakers during the 1930s, many women got jobs. They were allowed to work, but there was a negative stereotype that held women back. This included low wages, no labor, and poor working conditions.
During World War I, large numbers of women were recruited into jobs vacated by men who were now fighting in the war. This led to women working in areas of work that were formerly reserved for men, such as clerks, bank tellers, railway guards, and even working in the police force. However, they received lower wages for doing the same work, and this became some of the earliest demands for equal pay.
After the war, when the men came back, it was assumed that the jobs that the women had taken over would be given back to the men. Women were expected to go back to their society expectations of staying at home. It went so far that even the government created a poster campaign to encourage women to leave their jobs. The Women's Department of the Canadian Reconstruction Association published booklets informing women that no other work that a woman can do is as important to Canada as making a home and taking care of children. It was much more acceptable for single women to work as opposed to women who were married. Unfairness and attitude towards women inspired women to fight back.
So women changed very much right after the war. They started cutting their hair, which they were supposed to have long hair and keep them in braids. They started wearing pants, and they were supposed to wear conservative dresses or long skirts. They started changing their way of life and refused to stay at home and be the perfect wife. So post-war, women felt empowered, knowing that they could contribute just as much to their community as men could. And they realized all the disadvantages of just staying at home. And they knew that men could also do the same. Groups of women were formed revolving around women's rights. A group was the suffragettes, and protested by speaking up and making banners to increase awareness. Overall, all of this contributed to women being independent and women equality in the 1920s.
Women's suffragette groups had existed since the 1870s, but during the war it was hard to ignore their arguments. Women were serving in the war, taking over from the men in factories and offices, holding families together while the men were overseas, and working in voluntary organizations that supported the war effort. They could not be kept out of politics any longer. In Quebec, Marie Lacoste Gérine Lajoie was one of the women who founded the Fédération Nationale Saint-Jean-Baptiste in 1907. This organization campaigned successfully to improve working conditions for women, bring in pasteurized milk to reduce infant mortality, and increase women teachers' pensions. However, she found little support in Quebec for women's suffrage. Early feminists in Canada included women like Emily Stowe, who supported her children and sick husband by working, illegally, as a doctor in Ontario. She'd had to have to go to New York to obtain her degree, since Canadian women weren't allowed in medical school or any other higher educational institution at that time. She graduated in 1868. In 1876, she started the Toronto's Women Literacy Club, which was actually a women's suffragette group. The first province to give women the vote was Manitoba. This was where Nellie McClung had rented the Walker Theatre in Winnipeg in 1914 and staged a mock parliament, casting herself as premier and putting men in the role of having to beg her for the vote. The event was a great success, both financially and politically. McClung was also one of the 5 women who campaigned to have women recognized as persons by the Supreme Court so that they could qualify to sit on the Senate. They were finally successful with their persons case in 1929. The women's suffragette movement was often linked with temperance societies, which were demanding the prohibition of alcohol. Women argued that excessive drinking by men ruined family life and led to much more domestic violence. But alcohol wouldn't likely be abolished, they said, until women got the vote. By 1914, the movement was gaining momentum, but Canada still lagged behind. countries such as Australia, New Zealand, and parts of the United States where women had already gotten the vote. By this time, a large number of Canadian men, including politicians, supported the right for women to vote, but the movement still needed a breakthrough. The turning point came in Manitoba, McClung's home province. Opposition leader, Liberal T.C. Norris, agreed to give women the vote if he became premier in the 1915 election. Norris won. Women got the federal vote in 3 stages. The Military Voters Act of 1917 allowed nurses and women in the armed service to vote. The Wartime Election Act extended the vote to women who had husbands, sons, or fathers serving overseas, and all women over the age of 21 were allowed to vote as of January 1st, 1919. Provincially, women were given the vote in 1916 in the 4 western provinces, in 1917 in Toronto, in 1918 in Nova Scotia, in 1919 in New Brunswick, in 1922 in Prince Edward Island, and last but not least, 1940 in Quebec.
Irene Parley was born in England to a well-off family, and growing up never knew and never planned to be a politician. She immigrated to Alberta with her husband and became a homesteader. Her efforts to help improve the lives of rural Alberta women and children led her into the United Farm World of Alberta, where she became president. From there, she was elected to the Legislative Assembly of Alberta and became the first woman cabinet minister in Alberta. Irene Parley was also one of the famous 5 Alberta women who fought and won the political and legal battle in the Persons Case, to have women recognized as persons under the BNA Act. Louise McKinney was one of the first 2 women elected to the Alberta Legislative Assembly, and one of the first 2 women elected to the legislature in Canada and in the British Empire. She was an excellent debater, and she worked on legislation to help people with disabilities, immigrants, widows, and separated wives. Louise McKinney was also one of the famous 5 Alberta women who fought and won the political and legal battles in the Persons Case. And she was also a lifelong organizer and supporter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, also known as WCTU. And it was a worldwide organization that sought to protect women and children, particularly by eliminating what they saw as a destructive influence of alcohol.
Henrietta Moyer Edwards, a modern woman, used her determination, perseverance, and dedication to help improve the plight of women of her time. Throughout her career, her concerns were transformed into direct involvement in women's rights. Born in Montreal in 1849, in her early years, Henrietta Louise Moyer developed an interest in women helping women. Raised in an affluent, cultured, and religious family, Henrietta joined the women's movement, becoming actively involved in different religious organizations and coming face-to-face with the injustices of old traditions, where the exclusion of women was widely accepted. In Canada, the United States, and Europe, she pursued studies in the field of arts, which strengthened her determination to ensure recognition for women in activities to which little consideration had previously been given. Welcome back. I'm Gary Siricu, and today we're going to be talking to the ghost of Emily Murphy. Emily, how are you?
I'm good, how are you?
Good, thank you. So, I hope you don't mind if I ask you a couple of questions regarding your accomplishments in the 1920s and 30s.
Okay.
Let's get right into it. So, when and where were you born?
I was born in Edmonton, Alberta on March 14th, 1868.
Okay, and what made you want to start advocating for women's rights?
Well, I always had an issue about how young women were treated at home and at the workplace, and I couldn't sleep knowing that I could somehow change this way of life.
Okay, and so how did the Famous 5 come to be?
Well, originally, I enlisted the help of 4 other Albertan women, and on the 27th of August, 1927, the human rights activists Nellie McClung, Louise McKinney, Henrietta Edwards, and Irene and I signed a petition to the federal cabinet asking that they refer the issue to the Supreme Court of Canada, and it worked, so here we are.
So tell me, what was the issue in question?
Well, all of us found it horrible that women were not persons under Section 24, and that they were not eligible for appointment to the Senate.
Unbelievable. So, what was your greatest achievement, and why was it your greatest achievement?
Well, being that I helped convince the Albertan government pass the Dower Act, which allowed a wife's right to a third share of her husband's property if he passed away, and also helped in the process of making women persons, and it was always a dream of mine to live in a country where women and men could work alongside one another and were treated as equals.
So tell me, how do you think what you accomplished in the 1920s affected the way women are perceived today?
Well, in my opinion, what the Famous Five and I did back in the 1920s had a huge effect on how women are looked at, because nowadays women are empowering humans that lots of people look up to, and knowing that women are setting an example to everyone and actually have a voice now definitely has been one of the greatest things that I have achieved and has happened in our lifetime.
You've definitely led a very illustrious career. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Good morning, Miss McClung. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Great. So now let's jump into these 3 questions I have for you.
Okay.
Can you please tell me about yourself?
Well, I was born in Chatsworth, Ontario, and I've always been known to be quite honest and outspoken. And I've always believed that women should not have to stay at home and cook and clean, because I wanted to do what the men did. I wanted to work and I wanted to get an education. I also felt very strongly that women are quite empowering and are just as good as men. Not more, but definitely not less.
Okay. And what are you known for?
Well, I'm known for being part of the Alberta Five, or also the Famous Five, and I've always fought for women's rights in Canada, including voting.
Very good. What are your greatest achievements contributing to women's rights?
Well, I would have to say I have 2 major achievements. Number 1 being I helped women slowly gain the right to vote in Canada, one province at a time. And number 2, the victory of the 1929 Persons Case.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I fell in love with you.
In 1929, a major achievement for Canadian women took place, and this was the Persons Case. The Persons Case was a constitutional ruling that established the right of women to be appointed to the Senate, and the case was initiated by the Famous Five, which was a group of prominent women activists. In 1928, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that women were not persons according to the British North America Act, which is also called the BNA Act, and therefore were ineligible for appointment to the Senate. However, the women appealed to the Privy Council of England, which in 1929 reversed the court's decision. The Persons Case opened the Senate to women, enabling them to work for change in both the House of Commons and the Upper House. Most importantly, the legal recognition of women as persons meant that they could no longer be denied rights by the law. The British North America Act of 1867, now known as the Constitution Act, was the law that created and governed the Dominion of Canada. According to Section 24 of the BNA Act, only qualified persons could be appointed to the Senate. Qualified persons included those of at least 30 years of age who owned property worth at least $4,000, and they also had to be born and live in the province of their appointment. In 1867, a person was legally understood to only refer to men, and they held this position until female activists in Alberta proposed Emily Murphy, Canada's first woman magistrate, for a Senate position. After this, thousands of women across Canada, including the National Council of Women of Canada, the Federated Women's Institutes, and the Montreal Women's Club, all supported Murphy's appointment, and many newspapers also helped her cause too. To activists, the government was using Section 24 of the BNA Act as an excuse for stalling. In August 1927, Emily Murphy invited 4 prominent women activists, Nellie McClung, Irene Parbley, Louise McKinney, and Henrietta Muir Edwards, to her home in Edmonton. Her plan was to send a petition to the Canadian government regarding the interpretation of the word persons in the BNA Act. According to Section 60 of the Supreme Court Act, a group of 5 persons could petition the government to to direct the Supreme Court to interpret a law in the BNA Act. And on 27th August 1927, the famous five signed a letter which was sent to the Governor General. And the petition asked that the Supreme Court rule on the following two questions. Number 1, is power vested in the Governor General and Council of Canada or the Parliament of Canada, or either of them, to appoint a female to the Senate of Canada? And number 2, is it constitutionally possible for the Parliament of Canada, under the provisions of the British North America Act, or otherwise, to make provision for the appointment of a female to the Senate of Canada? The Supreme Court ruled women not persons, and were therefore ineligible for appointment to the Senate. But the famous five were not defeated, definitely disappointed, but not defeated. There was one higher authority to which they could appeal, which was the Privy Council of England. And after much consideration and time, the Privy Council reversed the decision of the Supreme Court on 18th of October 1929, concluding that the word persons does include women, and that women are eligible to be summoned and to become members of the Senate of Canada. So the significance of the persons case was that women had now legally been recognized as persons, and which meant that women could no longer be denied many rights by law. And secondly, women could now continue to work for greater rights and opportunities through the Senate as well as the House of Commons. And following this, in 1930, Corinne Wilson became Canada's first woman senator. And in the end, the persons case was a significant moment in the history of women's rights, even though the struggle for equality continues now.
You sweet home.